Hello everyone and welcome back to the video. After all the positive responses and feedback on that first video I made a while back, which is top 5 civs that need a nerf, I decided to make a follow-up video, and this time we're going to be taking a look at the top 5 civilizations that need a buff in Age of Empires 2, so the complete opposite side of the spectrum. And if you guys haven't checked out that first video, I'm going to leave a link to it in the description below. You can watch it before or after this video if you're interested. But without further ado, let's hop right in and check out the top 5 civs that need a buff this time around. Alright, so starting off at number 5, we're going to be taking a look at the Persians. Persians are an interesting civilization because they have a few options that are pretty good in the early game, but as the game transitions towards the late game, they start running out of options. Not only that, but their economy in most of the game rather, it sounds way better than it is. So they've got one economy bonus pretty much, two rather. One where they start the game with an extra 50 food and 50 wood, which is really good. And then the other one which lets the town centers work faster. However, this bonus is actually really good only when going for like a 1 or 2 TC approach, or when you're going for like an all-out boom. On a standard game of Arabia where you're trying to like add a lot of town centers and also keep up with production, oftentimes you don't have the food to keep your town centers running with Persians, and you end up just having a generic civilization. This bonus doesn't end up helping as much as you'd expect it would help, and so Persians in general just feel like an underwhelming civilization, and for that reason I think it requires a little bit of a buff. Now the buff I would probably suggest is to give back the dock bonus and the town center bonus work from Dark Age. This gives them a 1 villager lead by the time they get to Feudal Age, and it also lets them get a fishing ship lead or faster fishing ships if there's water involved on the map, which makes them very relevant on hybrid maps, as well as maybe even some pure water maps if you want to go for some cheese early game strategy with some better economy. Overall, I don't think Persians is the worst civilization ever, but it's definitely one that could use a small buff just to make it a little bit more viable and a little bit more unique in some ways, because right now it just feels a little bit too generic and a little bit too vanilla for my taste. Alright, moving on to number 4, we're going to be taking a look at a civilization that a particular player is really fond of, and that is of course Huang for the player and Celts for the civilization. Celts is a civilization that I think requires a small buff, and I say small because I think it's a good civ up until mid-Castle Age. I don't think you need to change anything. It's got a powerful siege push, it's got a few different options, and it's got a fantastic economy, and it is still balanced because without bloodlines on the knights, they lack a little bit of power in the mid-game, but it's compensated because of their other options. However, moving on towards the late game, it almost feels like you're forced to go into like siege and infantry, which is the best tools that Celts have available to them. And while you have a couple options there, either Halberdier Champion or maybe Woad Raider, I think it's a little bit limited because on most games, infantry alone is not going to cut it for your late game. They obviously do have some decent stable units, but nothing too crazy there. But what I would recommend giving the Celts, just to give them a little bit more options in the late game, is just giving them the last armor upgrade for the archers and skirmishers. So the last armor upgrade from the blacksmith, and all that this does is let them go for skirmishers at a little bit more of a viable pace in the late game. Right now, their archer range units are really weak in late game. Their stable units are really weak, and I think that giving them a little bit of a boost for their archer units, it can help out a lot. And the main practicality of this buff is to give Celts an answer to Cav archers in late game. Cav archer plus Hussar is a composition that will destroy Celts in a 1v1 open map, and also in most hybrid maps, and because the Cav archers can outrun onagers and halberdier, and the Hussars can just use the mobility to raid the Celts economy and to snipe some siege. So Celts really don't have an answer to that very popular composition. I think giving them slightly stronger skirms can really help out in that department, and in general the civilization isn't even really strong in late game on most maps, so giving them a small boost for open maps there can really help out. Alright, moving on to number 3, we've got the Slavs. What's interesting is the Slavs used to actually be a very strong civilization before Definitive Edition came out, but they received a nerf that made their farming bonus go from 15% to where it's at currently, which is 10%. This was a pretty big nerf because that was pretty much the main reason why Slavs were strong, but I believe that since that bonus was nerfed, a lot of other civilizations came out that are naturally way stronger than the Slavs. And I think right now Slavs are in a position where they're basically like exactly like Celts, but they have stronger cav but weaker siege. It's a very weird civilization. It has some decent options these days by going with boyars and spamming those castles. That can be kind of interesting in some matchups, and in general it has a decent knight and siege play in Castle Age as well, but it's a little bit too generic and you lack a lot of power with the civ. And now I'd either recommend giving it an option to have like a little bit more flexibility for the civilization, maybe in the archer range departments, or, and something I prefer more, just give them back the 15% farm bonus. It makes them a lot stronger. It makes them a civilization that actually has a good power spike and a good win condition, using those farms to good work. Think of it this way, Poles have much better farms than Slavs, and Khmer, I don't know about the number, but not making mills, having perfectly efficient farms, I consider Khmer farms better than Slav farms, and that just feels so wrong to me. So giving Slavs a little bit of a bump there for their farms could be the way to go, and make the civs just much more interesting in my opinion. Alright, moving on to number 2, we've got the Dravidians, part of the new expansion. Dravidians are a very underwhelming civilization in my opinion, although they have a really cool bonus getting the extra wood, and they have some really nice options in the late game with Wood Steel, faster firing skirmishers, and of course Urumi Swordsmen, their unique units. Dravidians overall though feel very predictable, especially in that early game. Their stable is abysmally weak. They have not even a knight, not even a camel, no bloodlines, and so their units are really bad from the stable. The elephant doesn't really do a whole lot for the civ, and so I'm okay with the civilization having a weak stable, but when it's so weak like the Dravidians where you can't even use it at all in most cases, then I think that the civilization just becomes too predictable. You force them into going into archery range units, and it's so easy to counter them with skirms. And you might be thinking, well, Dravidians can make better skirms. The problem comes if both players are making skirmishers, the other guy can just mix in knights, plus 2 knights to wipe the skirms, and then what do Dravidians do? They're just stuck with skirms. They can make a couple monks to convert knights, they can switch to pikes, but those are already getting counted by the skirms, so it just becomes a very messy situation, and I think that Dravidians will pretty much die to any civilization that has knight and skirm as an option in Castle Age. That just feels a little bit too weak in my opinion. My proposed buff for Dravidians is one of 2 options, or maybe even both. A, we give them bomber cannon in the late game. This gives them at least some option to dealing with onagers with +1 range, because right now they have very low cavalry and they don't have bomber cannon, and so how do they deal with onagers? They can't. So give them bomber cannon for the late game, and then the second option is to give them the knight in the stable. I actually think this is the better option because Dravidians, you can't play pocket with the civilization. If you get them as pocket in Arabia team game, or in any team game pretty much, you can't play them. You're forced to go archers from the pocket, but it's not even that strong of an archer civilization anyways. So if from the pocket position they have literally nothing, so giving them at least the knight, even if you keep the bad upgrades, will help them out a tiny bit and give them at least a few options for 1v1 and for the pocket in team game. So that's my take on Dravidians. Give them a little bit of boost from the stable to not make it that bad, because right now the Aztecs have a better stable if you get a conversion. Like, that's ridiculous. Yeah, and then maybe give them the bomber cannon in the late game. Alright, before I show you guys number 1 on my list, I'm going to go ahead and talk about a few honorable mentions that I feel are worth talking about. First one is the Spanish. A lot of people think that the Spanish need a buff because they're weak on 1v1 Arabia. I personally highly disagree with that. Well, I agree that they're terrible on 1v1 Arabia for the most part, but I do think that they're really strong on other maps, and they have their place in the game as a civilization that's a powerhouse in late game, giving extra trade for team games, so they have their place in team game, and they also have a really strong unit in the Conquistador for the Castle Age and onwards. They're also extremely strong on nomadic type maps, and so with all that considered, I really feel like Spanish is in a good spot. Just because it's bad on 1v1 Arabia does not mean it needs a buff. That's my take on the Spanish. If I were to buff the civilization, I don't even know where I'd begin. Maybe I'd buff the building bonus a little bit, or maybe I'd give them a small little boost in the early game, but truly I feel like the civilization is okay where it's at right now. Alright, moving on to the Burmese now for honorable mentions. Burmese is another civ that a lot of people think need a buff, and I can see the arguments for this one. Burmese are quite weak to archer civilizations. However, well, I think the proposed patch in the August patch, which was released a while back, that they said that they're gonna nerf crossbow and arbalest upgrades, making them more expensive. And so I think with a nerf to crossbow and arbalest, that's gonna be an indirect buff to Burmese, because it's by far their worst matchup is like archer civs. And I think Burmese, aside from dying to archer civs, are actually a very strong civilization. Not even a decent one. I think they're very strong, having access to really good monk technologies, amazing infantry, and also a decent unique unit and decent cavalry. Combining all those options with now a strong economy bonus, getting free wood upgrades, just makes for a very smooth situation for this civilization. Alright, for my last honorable mention, I've got the Malay. I really think that Malay is in a pretty good spot right now, especially for hybrid maps. However, you could give them a small buff just to help them out for their late game and make it more interesting. And my proposed buff is probably just to make the two-handed swordsman a little bit more viable for Malay. I know they're like cheap and they cost no gold and stuff, but I think that right now maybe making them a few food cheaper, like 5 or 10 food cheaper, might make them a little bit more interesting to go into. Right now, it just feels like if Malay goes for two-handed swordsman, the other guy can just go for Hussar, and Hussar are literally just better in most cases because of mobility. Yes, Hussar died to halbs, but two-handed swordsmen don't die to halbs, but two-handed swordsmen die to a lot of things, like even like skirms and arbalest can thin them down easily. So yeah, maybe just making the two-handed swordsman slightly cheaper for Malay, making it more interesting of an option, can be a good place to start. But in general, I think the civilization is okay, but it could use a small buff here or there. Last and least, actually, it's Bengali. I was gonna say last and not least, but this is literally the least. We've got Bengali, one of the worst civilizations I've ever seen in Age of Empires, honestly. I read a comment once that said that the devs should just remove Bengali and apologize for making them, which I thought was pretty funny and kind of true, because like, where do I even start with this civilization? It almost feels like the fastest way to fix the civilization is just to remove it and replace it with something else. The civilization is really abysmal. The worst part about it is that I thought it was pretty good a while back because of the Ratha being a strong unit. Turns out the Ratha has a lot of counters, and it's really not that powerful unit. Yes, it's strong in a lot of cases, but if you can just get to like Skirmisher and like some cav units, the Ratha doesn't really do a whole lot. It has very slow fire rate and DPS in late game, and it's kind of a mix between like a tanky unit and an archer unit, which ends up just being an awkward unit in general to use and to make use of, especially in the late game. So although it is powerful, it is very awkward, and it's not exactly the best unit. And besides the Ratha, the Civ gets nothing else. You literally don't have any option. Your stable is terrible, your archer range isn't fantastic, you're lacking thumb ring. So yeah, you can go Arbalest and Halberdier, but you're lacking thumb ring, so it's not that interesting. Aside from that, you have a very weak economy bonus, getting 2 extra villagers per age up. On most maps, this is very weak because those 2 villagers take very long to pay back, and you don't get any saving besides that. And sure, on closed maps, it could be nice because you get to get extra villagers, you're untouched, your economy gets to develop freely. That's probably the best use for Bengali, but aside from that, now, or even with that, their units are not very interesting. They don't get Hussar, they don't get amazing Arbalest. The Wrath, like I said, is awkward. Their siege is pretty average. So in general, the civilization just doesn't get anything, and it's just not worth playing for the most part here. So, and again, they suffer the same problem as Dravidians. They can't play pockets on Arabia, and they die to skirmishers in Castle Age pretty much every time. You could think, oh, the Ratha replaces the knight, but the Ratha also dies to skirm, so it's not really an option. So yeah, that's pretty much it for Bengalis and for my list in general. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys agreed, do let me know with what you agreed with. And if you guys disagreed, also let me know with what you disagreed with in the comment section below. I always like to read you guys' comments, and I think especially with a topic like this, man, we can have a lot of different opinions. At the end of the day, this is just mine and the list that I composed, but I'm sure you guys can bring some very valid points to the discussion and to the table. So let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.